Hello again, everyone. I'm Dr. George Simon, and welcome to another edition of Character Matters, the program where we talk about what I consider to be the defining issue of our time, the character crisis that we've faced for several decades now, and that affects every single aspect of our lives. Today, because we're live, if you want to join the conversation, you can participate with me live by either going to my website at drgeorgesimon.com. That's www.drgeorgesimon.com. You see that scrolling at the bottom of your screen. Or you can click the link to enter the studio from the YouTube channel, or copy it from the banner that you see running below you and enter the studio and participate live. Today, our program is probably going to run a little less of a time than usual, probably be a half-hour program today instead of an hour. And I'd like to talk about two things primarily, but we're open to anything you want to discuss if you enter the studio. I want to talk about the two major types of narcissism in particular. And I also want to talk about the relationship between culture and character, and especially what happens when in certain kinds of cultures and governmental structures, impaired character creates problems for people trying to follow the rules and behave in a respectable manner. Welcome to you folks entering on the chat. And I hope you don't mind, but today we're going to try a new thing. When I see something coming in on the chat that looks like it might benefit others to see on the broadcast, I may put it up on the screen with permission. So welcome all those entering the chat. Let me start by addressing the issues that I wanted to address that I mentioned earlier about narcissism. When I first started writing about character disturbances well over 30 years ago, even before the first edition of my first book, In Sheep's Clothing, came out in 1996, even before that, I was handing out spiral-bound editions of various manuscripts at workshops and training seminars. So even before that, I was discussing with attendees at these workshops the fact that my experience in clinical research had shown me that there were two very, very different types of narcissism. The literature at that point and the dominant theories still at that point in our evolutionary history and psychology was still promoting the notion that all narcissism was an unconscious reaction to inner feelings of insecurity, low self-esteem, poor self-image, etc., etc. So what you saw in narcissism supposedly was an unconsciously driven attempt to prove one's worth, sometimes in a braggadocious manner, sometimes in a pompous manner, but underneath it all, the person was really insecure, wounded in some way with respect to their self-image, etc., etc. And in the early research and in my writings in the workshops, I mentioned that I had seen some examples of that. So that can be true. And a lot of people still think that is the whole picture, but it isn't. What I promoted then at the workshops and started writing about was the fact that there are other brands of narcissism, one other major brand that is not a compensation for anything. and is characterized by many other features being present other than the pomposity, the braggadocio, or whatever you want to call it. Um, a heartless kind of predisposition to use and exploit people and to manipulate, et cetera, et cetera. And so I was saying basically that there were two very different kinds of narcissism, and we needed to be careful not to overgeneralize. Well, it took the literature some years to kind of catch up with that, but I was really edified and actually a little surprised when when the research started confirming the fact. And nowadays, most folks agree that there is a vulnerable, compensatory type of narcissism there. Um, but there is also another kind of narcissism of a grandiose type where it's not basically an act, where the person really does believe they're all that. And the real person really does believe they're entitled to do things and have things that others aren't, and is willing to interact with others in a demeaning and exploitative way precisely because of that felt superiority and entitlement. A very, very different brand of narcissism. Having its origins, by the way, too, in some very, very different dynamics. Uh, there are ways to become a more compensatory, a more vulnerable type of narcissist that have to do with being denied a sense of real value, being demeaned as a child, being disowned in a way, either physically or emotionally. Those kinds of things can really traumatize an individual as they're trying to develop a solid sense of health, a solid sense of self, I should say. But there's another kind of dynamic at work in the formation of a grandiose narcissist. Too much entitlement, too much being told how special they are, too much being told and praised for natural attributes that really have nothing to do with their character, but are gifts that they don't properly respect. Um, Folks who are overly indulged, overly coddled, made to feel special, superior, end up very, very, very different characters. And they're more inclined to treat others with disrespect and disfavor and to look down upon others. So, folks who get in relationships with these kinds of individuals are in for a much, much different experience than with the more vulnerable narcissistic types. And one of the dangers currently out there is that we're painting once again with a broad brush. Many folks are so called experts in the field of narcissism. There's one around every corner these days. Painting with a very, very broad brush. Narcissists do this, narcissists do that. It matters what kind of narcissist you're talking about. It also matters what kind of features that they have. Some folks have real skill at interpersonal relationships, even though they be narcissistic. You can be very skilled at the art of human connection and still be a narcissist. I know that sounds contradictory, but it's not. Some people have actually good relational skills. They know, for example, how to listen and how to act interested and how to act as though they value you, even though they don't. Some folks are really good actors. they get it in so many ways. This is another mistake that therapists and laypersons make when it comes to disturbed characters, assuming most of the time that they just don't see what they're doing or they're just not aware, when in fact they may be quite aware, but also know how to put on the act. Uh, Positive impression management, we call it. Knowing how to look good without actually being good. Knowing how to look like you care when you don't care. I see one interesting question here. I hope you don't mind me showing it. Person identifying as War on Dogs. It's a great question. I'm going to show it here. Why do they feel they have more rights than others? Why wouldn't others have the same entitlement as them? Great question. Great question. With the grandiose narcissists, it's because in their formational years, they may have. Now, let me preface this way. I am not one of those folks that says nurture does it all. Nature plays a big role here. And it's this false debate between nature and nurture is just that. It's a false debate. Both things play a role, and there's a dynamic interaction between the two that helps shape an individual. So that's actually another program. We could spend a whole program on that. But many times in the formational histories of these types, they are told not only that they're special and that they're superior, their parents or caretakers model that for them. Act haughty, act like their family is better than other families, and that other people don't really merit the consideration that they do. So it's a whole different formative experience. Plus, in this grandiose brand of narcissism, many times, right from the get go, naturally, there's some kind of impairment to some degree, maybe to a great degree, maybe to a small degree, impairment in the capacity for human empathy, impairment in the capacity to actually care about others. And so when you feel superior, and when you feel entitled, and when you feel special, like the rules don't apply to you, and you lack the capacity to care, your interactions with others are going to be naturally exploitative, potentially abusive. People are seen more as objects to manipulate for your own personal satisfaction and gain. And that does not mean that the person doesn't also have some skill in how to manage people's impressions of them. Perhaps the most dangerous kind of grandiose narcissist is the grandiose narcissist that also has some charm capacity, some skill at looking caring, even though they can't care and don't care, at looking interested in you and seeing value in you when they actually don't, outside of maybe you being an object for their personal satisfaction. Perhaps the most dangerous kind of grandiose narcissist is the person that has some skill to look good and to endear you when in fact this is the kind of person you would want to stay away from if you knew better, but more than likely you don't know better until you're well into the relationship and have been otherwise used, abused, or exploited. That's just the way it goes. I want to show another comment here that I think is really interesting. It's from a person identifying as the dark broken heart. I'd like to show this one too and read it. still having an issue arguing or trying to get the most simple or even single logical thing from them. How to establish at least a progress, a, a good grade, a progress, or even stop the disrespect. I think I understand what this question is trying to get at. Um, you know, in any kind of relational experience with a grandiose narcissist, especially, is going to be taxing because you want to be able to engage on a real heart to heart level, a personal level, one in which you're respected for who you are, your value is seen for what it truly is, and you want to show a similar degree of regard to the other person. And so you're looking to engage at a level that the grandiose narcissist not only doesn't want to engage at that level, but also may actually abhor such a notion. And for a long time, we thought that any of that kind of abhorrence was necessarily rooted in fear. It's not. Some some folks are wired in such a way, if you will, to simply have a distaste for interactions that are mutual, where folks meet each other at an equal, respectful level and just want to have a healthy, wholesome dialogue or interchange. Some folks hate that. And in my books, I explain that for some character impaired people, grandiose narcissists among them, and all the folks that I call the aggressive personalities, like they say in real estate, where only three things matter: location, location, and location. For these kinds of folks, only three things matter, and that is position, position, and position. And what I mean by that is that the idea of a level playing field, a level meeting of the minds, an equality of meeting of mind and heart is absolutely abhorrent to these individuals. They want a position of dominance, superiority, and they right off the bat strive to give there in any encounter with you, and they strive to stay there. And they can do it in ways that seem benign. As I mentioned earlier, they can do it with charm and with persuasion and with charisma. They may have developed that art so that you automatically, naturally tend to afford them a bit of a position. And they're happy with that. They hate it. They just detest it when you're in this kind of a position relative to them. In other words, when you need and want to set some appropriate boundaries and limits and rules, terms of engagement, as I call them, in sheep's clothing, they hate that. They hate being in the one down position. Some psychologists still insist that's because they feel vulnerable and they're afraid of that. No, 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 no. Not all the time. Yeah, sometimes that can happen. Most of the time, it's an inner revulsion they have to not being on top and in control. And so long as you're here and they're here, they're very happy. They will settle for this if they absolutely have to, and only for practical reasons, but they will never really accept a position that's one down in relationship with you, especially when you want to set some rules because of their past actions and disrespect of you. So that's important to keep in mind. It's important to keep in mind what really motivates these folks. And it's important to keep in mind that as a field, psychology is still evolving, very much evolving. And things that were gospel, I promise you, things that were gospel when I was in my training years ago, and it's not that long. I know I'm old. I just celebrated my 77th birthday. And one of these days, I think I will actually finally fully retire. But when I was being trained, some of the things that we regarded as absolute gospel, we laugh at now. We laugh at the ridiculousness of some of the concepts. Let me just give you a couple of them. Some folks probably have never even heard of these kinds of crazy notions, but they were actually not only advanced, but taught. For example, there was this theory that autistic children, folks on the autistic spectrum, got that way because their mothers, in nurturing them and especially in nursing them, back when that was a much more common thing. Of course, we've gone through phases with that. Anyway, the theory was that mothers were too cold. They weren't warm when they were providing nurturant care or nursing. And that led to detachment early on. And that's how the children became autistic to one degree or another. Oh my goodness. To preach such a theory today, to advocate such a position today, you'd be laughed out of the room. But I promise you, this was not too long ago that this kind of thing was being taught. So many of the things that we thought contributed to human development are thinking on bullies and what makes them tick. All kinds of things. We now realize we were so misguided. And I am sure that 40 years from now, 50 years from now, if we're all still around, God help us, I'm sure we'll look back and say, what were we thinking? What were we thinking? This is how we advance in knowledge. One of the things that scares me a lot is that character disturbance has pervaded our sciences too. So unfortunately, we don't have the humble skepticism that's necessary to be a really good scientist. Science searches for truth in a particular way, but you also have the character to not overplay your findings and to remain curious and to remain humble about what you do come across and to not overplay it, regard it as the panacea that some folks want to promote it, and to know that even when you come across a bit of knowledge, there is plenty still left to learn. And you may learn in 20 or 30 years that what you thought was true was only partly true, or maybe not even true at all. So character plays a role in everything. In all human enterprises, it's the most important thing. And that brings me to the last thing I wanted to talk about, and that is that in a society, however it's structured, any freedom that's afforded either in rules or the constitutional setup of the society or in the kinds of government or the laws that are passed, every bit of human freedom depends upon character. The more wholesome of character the people are that populate a society, the less of a need there is to micromanage them. You can let them have free rein. And if you do, good people will do wonderful things that help them prosper and help the whole community prosper. It's a wonderful concept, but freedom and character go hand in hand. When the society is populated by folks characterized by a marked sense of entitlement, by moral ambiguity, no moral center, and no firm internalization of the values and standards of conduct that would help them navigate life and relationships in a wholesome way. When so many character impaired people populate a society, then there's always the temptation to try to micromanage things through oppressive rules and structures in the hopes that we can kind of keep ourselves as civil as possible. It all hinges on character. It always has. It always will. It's the answer. It's really the answer. It always has been. And I'm glad to hear I'm glad to see some people chiming in with some affirmation about that. I know in my heart that it's true, that it's true. And I have to tell you, I've learned the hard way, both personally and experientially. Life has had to teach me some pretty hard lessons, whether I've been observing it in the people that I've tried to help over the years or even in myself. And that's why I firmly believe how this is all going to turn around is just that, like I was telling my friend Jared the other day in a podcast that is going to be posted on the YouTube channel here in just a few minutes, maybe an hour or so. I was telling him, and we were having a nice discussion on the fact that we do need to turn things around, but how we have to do it is the same way it's always been done. You know, we didn't get in this mess all of a sudden. It happened incrementally, slowly, insidiously, over quite a bit of time. A vicious cycle of sorts. I've talked about it many times. And that's how we get out of it too, incrementally, slowly, one heart at a time, beginning with our own. One heart at a time, beginning with our own. Wholesome character is naturally attractive. It impacts people in a positive way. So that's why it has to start with us. And that's the point that I make, the main point that I make in Essentials for the Journey, my most recent book. And so Jared and I had a real robust discussion about that. Once again, I invite you, we're going to be wrapping up here very soon. I invite you to tune in to these live editions of Character Matters on the first and the third Wednesday of every month. The first and the third Wednesday of every month, with some exceptions for holidays and some circumstances that can't be avoided. But the first and the third Wednesday at 12 noon Central Time. That's 1 p.m. Eastern Time, and then there's also 11 Mountain Time and 10 a.m. Pacific Time. So until then, I invite you to navigate over to the blog at drgeorgesimon.com and avail yourself of the timely articles there. Also to avail yourself of all my books and to tune in again for another edition of Character Matters and avail yourself of any of the recordings and other postings of Character Matters on the YouTube channel. So until next time, I thank you for tuning in. Once again, thank you for all the wonderful comments. And I'll see you next time on the next edition of Character Matters. Until then, I'm Dr. George Simon. Take care now.